Yes, you're live.
Awesome. Good evening, everyone. Once again, we are excited to have another guest in our show called Beyond Code, wherein we uncover the stories which takes the coders mindset out in the public, as well as excite you to really understand what people behind the apps, the application, everything that you today use goes through. So today I have with me is Vipul. Vipul is currently the CTO at Tartan, a data exchange platform that enables real-time work and income verification, allowing employees to avail themselves of various perks, right? So, but the whole journey of Vipul is pretty interesting, and that's what we'll uncover today in our one next 1 hour, wherein he has been part of brands like Trail, Turtleman, and himself been a founder once. The discussion that I had before this particular event that we're going live today was very interesting with Vipul, where he mentions about how exactly he went on to become one of the first employees of the startup. We'll try to go detailed into what exactly went through his mind back then, but also we'll also understand from Vipul what Dehradun is all about in today's next 1 hour. Thanks a lot, Vipul, for joining us. It is a privilege to have you today.
Thank you, Jen. I mean, they're so excited to kind of be here.
Awesome, Vipul. To begin with, I think one of the basic and standard questions that I often ask everyone is let's go back. Let's go back to your the Chota Vipul, if I would take that liberty to say, how was he? Was he the kind of a guy who would ideally be the one who would sit in the bench and really ensure that he's right on the money the moment the teacher is sharing something, or he's one who's gonna is ensure will make use of the last bench and ensure that everyone enjoys the class rather than just study. So what was Vipul like back then?
So so my childhood, right? I mean that I always, if you say, I always was a backbencher, but not in the typical sense. Although I was studious, but I always sit in the back at the last. I mean, and I was good at study within my, because I belong to a very small town. My whole study happened in a small hill town called Gopeshwar, which is in Uttarakhand. And I most of my period I kind of studied in a government college and few private college, right? I mean that all Hindi medium at that time. And I always in the backbencher, but good with study. So that's what, if I in nutshell, this is that was kind of my childhood was. I was very silent, quiet guy. I mean that always in the good book of the teachers. So that was the good thing because I was good at study. So teacher generally gives liberty to them, right? I mean that. So that's what all about. I mean that in nutshell.
So I hope that you're not the one who's gonna sit and study inside a blanket. You're not that kind of a backbencher, right? Someone who ideally ensures that everyone is enjoying, he's going to study inside the blanket. You are more of that guy who would ensure that, okay, I'm going to do my own part of studies as well. I'm going to do my own masti.
So yeah, I mean that on the masti front, basically, I was not that much into that. I mean, just very studious. Why I kind of sit on the back bench because teacher will not notice, okay, what I am kind of doing there, right? Probably I'm reading some other book, right? I mean, there or doing some other thing apart from the kind of what they are kind of teaching us, right? I mean that, or probably doing the homework so that I can save time when I go back home, right? So that was the primary reason, if I recall around, right? I mean, so I used to sit only in the class 12. I was in the front bench. Although teacher always used to say, okay, come on the front bench, come on the front bench, but kind of only on the 12th class, I was in the first row. Otherwise, always been the back bencher. And that is due to one of my good friend, school time friend. He was also basically kind of generally sit at the with me in the back of the classroom, but he insisted, okay, that probably we should sit in the front. And that's how basically kind of say, okay, probably I will sit in the front. That's the only class I sit in the front. Even in the college I was in the back bench.
Got
So
it. Cool. It's a very interesting journey that you went on, and you went on to basically study from a place which might not have that kind of basically exposure to technology back then, right? What today's India, and to be honest, the Bharat that we say experiences technology, that level definitely was not there back in there. So what happened? When did you meet? And basically, was it love at first sight with tech? How exactly tech happened in your life?
So being the small town, right? I mean that engineering and doctor are the main thing, right? I mean that people focus on. Even the parents and whole ecosystem is around that. Apart from that, we didn't have any exposure. Okay, whatever kind of my focus is on, basically we have to do the engineering. I mean, just like that. And my whole kind of childhood was, especially after 10th, it gears towards that. And then I prepared for the engineering, and cleared cleared one of the exam, which is a regional engineering college exam, right? I mean that at that time UP and Uttarakhand was the same kind of state. So there was a exam called MLNR, Motilal Nehru Engineering College, kind of this thing, right? So I cleared that thing, and then kind of got an admission to a engineering college in Uttarakhand, right? Which is GB Pant Engineering College, Pori. So yeah, that's how I basically got into engineering. And uh, and then basically I kind of choose the computer science, and reason being that, okay, in my family, there was no one basically I can kind of look up to, right? I mean that as a mentor or as a kind of career guidance, right? For career guidance. But kind of I kept hearing, okay, that computer science is a new thing and kind of whatever, right? I heard about, I don't know where and how, I heard about the Sabir Bhatia and other stuff, right? I mean at that time, Hotmail guy. So I said there's something into it, and then I said, okay, probably because there was a trend or whatever, right? Heard kind of this thing mentality. So I just say, okay, probably computer science is the good choice. And that's obviously I got into the engineering side. But I was good with science, maths, and this thing. So that was a natural inclination also. Even there would be no social circumstances or whatever, right? I might have basically opted for the kind of engineering in any way, because I was good at maths and science. Others I didn't like much. I mean that history, civics, or whatever, right? I mean that generally I didn't like much. I mean that. So so if I say, right, I mean that given the choice, given the this thing, okay, in the current world, right? I mean that I would have made the same choice because I was good at that, maths and science.
Interesting. While we were also having a discussion, you mentioned about basically a choice that you made beyond getting exposed to tech was whether you want to go ahead and study more, right, versus a job, right? So you decided, no, I'm going to be more of the guy who's going to get into execution. What do you think? What was the right triggers? Was it, what is the love, or was it the kind of job that came in handy for you? What was your decision when you thought about not going, pursuing? And do you feel right now when you look back? Is what my question would always be. Do you think you want to change that?
I will answer the first thing. I mean that because that is one thing I always keep thinking, right? I mean, should I go for the higher study or should I not? I mean, at that time, I think I might have gone into this thing if, with the benefit and the wisdom of hindsight, right? I mean that I would have opted for that. I mean, that's my this thing. But at that time, I mean that as any lower middle class family, right? I mean that the earning money is always becomes the kind of priority, right? I mean that that is one piece. So kind of, I think that was the primary this thing. Uh, I decided, okay, probably the job is the way, right? I mean that to go ahead. Uh, so yeah, I mean that if I have to change that decision, I probably might have changed that decision. I mean that if I go back into the history and then change that, right? Yeah, region being age kind of uh, because when I kind of passed out of the college, right, I was not very good at programming, frankly speaking, right? At that time, I was job with this time. I was looking for a job where there is no programming and still be in the technical part, right? I mean, I was looking for that option in ideal scenario, right? But then and that's why I think, okay, probably if I go for the highest, I was good at basically kind of in college I was average. I mean, in terms of marks wise, but I have certain interest in certain subjects, so I just wanted to pursue those subjects, right? I mean that and do the higher study and then kind of explore that option. But then the job and other this thing and the reality kicks in and then say okay, kind of probably job is the more practical and kind of practical decision. But then kind of I didn't have kind of as I told you, right? I mean that the programming wise, I mean that there's not much exposure, and I didn't like that much. But then I realized, I mean, I don't know how, and this thing, I realized, okay, without programming, there's no future. I mean, that if I want to basically remain in the computer science field, then I have to learn the programming. And at that time, the sudden good thing happened. I mean, that during that period, right? I mean, so I came across this guy, Paul Graham, at that time. I started reading his essays and kind of other thing, and it made a huge impact. I mean, it changed my perspective. Okay, how to look at things, right? You develop your mental models and other stuff, right? So how to look at the programming. Earlier in the college, basically, kind of the programming was not much of the focus. Theoretical aspect of the computer science is much in the focus, right? But the Paul Graham essay and his reading his writings on the programming changed my perspective. And it kind of, once that wiring changed in your brain, right? I mean, that it started behaving very differently. And then I kind of just go all in the programming. So that's how basically kind of things happened, right? I mean, and then I
So,
realized, okay, that this is the field, I mean, that I want to be in, right? Computer science and the programming.
so if I go deeper in really understanding, I'm not aware since of what book Paul Graham basically wrote. What was the kind of, what would be your version of the highlights that someone can take away, and what exactly did that change brought into your whole, as you mentioned, your brain started to think in the north instead of the south. What was those triggers? If you can help us understand a little bit more here.
So Paul Graham, I mean, that you might be aware, right? He's kind of founder of Y Combinator and kind of things like that. Before that, he kind of built his own company called YWeb and kind of sold it to Yahoo. And his essays are mostly around programming, right? How programmer thinks, what are the programmers' role in the society, right? He made me think, okay, programmers are new age artists, right? I mean, that they create things, they build things. Otherwise, I was just earlier I was this thing, okay, the program is something we just program, right? I mean, that thinking was not there, okay, that building something from scratch. And so that is kind of one kind of aspect, right? I mean, that if I recall these wordings, what bit, I don't remember exact this thing, but that's the impression basically I got. And then that change whole perspective, right? I mean, that once you say, okay, you're a programmer, and then basically you change, you are a builder, right? I mean, that you're building something from scratch, and you work in the abstraction, right? I mean, that you can imagine things and can build it, and there's something tangible out there, right? I mean, that feeling was basically very contagious, right? I mean, that very inspiring for me. I mean, that at least. And then basically kind of then basically I went into the programming side of it. I mean that uh, uh, and then he wrote basically a couple of articles on the programming, what kind of programming languages, right? I mean that at that time he was kind of so I remember, say, one of the this thing is he talked about basically that programming language called Lisp. And I think and I got interested by that because his kind of idea in that essay is Lisp is a functional programming language, and once you write anything in Lisp, right, and you have to think your problem in a very different way, which when you compare it with the traditional way of thinking about the problem, right? I mean that I got interested in that. Every essay, I mean that then I read every essay of the Paul Graham, and everyone is gem. I mean that. So he got me interested in programming in itself, right? I mean the programming and the builder kind of mindset, and that made a huge impact. I mean overall perspective, right? I mean that how to think, how to kind of go about kind of exploring anything, right? I mean that. Uh,
Cool. I think what you use is absolutely right. It's about perspective to believe that you're solving it as an end to end and not just. So a lot of us, I think, when we do not understand the use case or the business use case, often get lost that with just a small little, what do you say, part of the whole pyramid. But once we have a clarity that okay, I'm going to solve it for this user, I think a lot of us come back because in my team also and across I've seen a lot of times a lot of good inputs which comes from developers even with respect to the marketing side of things because they predominantly understand the persona much better. uh, it's only because they're able to contribute it, only because they're able to look at the larger goal that we are chasing. So I
correct.
think yeah, I think clarity paramounts anything else. That's what I can absolutely correlate. So I understand that by now you, Vipul, if I go back to that Chota Vipul again, is that by now you're good, you're understanding programming. There's some kind of a love and basically a small little, I would say, some kind of a dating that has happened, and Paul Graham seems to be a cupid here. What happens then? Then you land up to your first job. What exactly went through? What was your whole experience of basically finding your first role in your career?
So my the first job, right, after graduating, right, I mean that I went for the, because in Uttarakhand there is literally no job, so you have to kind of move to the metros. And first few months I spent some time in Delhi and then try to figure out, okay, kind of is there any job there, and then kind of went into sudden walk-ins and kind of other stuff. And say, okay, the Delhi is not the happening place for that, right? I mean, the Bangalore was kind of picking up, and then some of our seniors basically kind of got their job in Bangalore. So we say, okay, probably I have to shift to the Bangalore, right? I mean that then I shifted to Bangalore at that time, and then for after a couple of months of searching for a job, I landed two job offer, and by during that period at Bangalore stay was job searching period very kind of interesting. I mean that and it has a huge impact. One thing I realized, okay, small companies exist, right? I mean that earlier we used to think about Infosys, TCS, and other stuff, right? I mean that because these were the major kind of recruiter. I mean that or who kind of recruit people in masses, right? And some of my friend, right, one of my college friend, right, I mean a school friend was there in Bangalore, and he was also kind of working in a small company. He was ID Delhi graduate. His name is Bebo. And with that basically I learned a lot of things. Okay, small company exists, good people work there, right? I mean that smart people works there. I mean that and then I somehow basically kind of that thing get into my mind, okay, that if I have, because as I told you, right, I mean the programming was not my forte at that time. If I have to kind of expedite my learning, I have to be surrounded with two things has to happen. I have to surround it with the smart people. That is first, and I have to expedite my learning. The 4 year which I lost in college from the programming point of view, right? I mean that I have to catch up, right? And that can only happen when I kind of join a small company, because you compress your learning, right? I mean that 4 year learning can compress in 1 year, right? So then basically I kind of, so I have two offers. One was a big company and one was a small company. I naturally basically I joined the kind of the smaller one, although the parents and others were saying, okay, kind of probably should join the big company. That big company was Mahindra British Telecom. At that time it was Mahindra and the British Telecom, two companies, a joint venture. I mean the Mahindra British Telecom, a huge consulting company, right? Service company. And then the other one is again in the consulting domain. It's a very small group of people. I think at that time 15 odd people, 15, 18 people. But all, and they are providing consulting to the automobile industry. And they were kind of and these are kind of all PhDs with multiple year of experience, masters, and kind of from some US industry, MIT and other stuff, right? And I was surrounded with those guys, and there were 15, 18 people, right? I was the 18th employee, I think. And they were kind of doing the consulting, building these models, right? I mean that simulation model on the MATLAB. And then they hired, I was the first C++ developer. By the time I become good at C++, because that's a job requirement, right? You have to get a job, you have to good at C++. So by the time I learned basically kind of C++ and then got that job, and then I was the first C++ developer. But I didn't have any real world kind of exposure, right? I mean that but then kind of so their job was simple. Okay, this simulator which they have built in the MATLAB, convert that into C++ so that it can be the faster simulation. So that's what my first job, and it was in Chennai. And I spent I think 10, 11 months there. And although I was liking my job, I mean that no doubt about that, because just being with the smart people, you learn a lot of things. I mean that you just expedite your learning, right? I mean that. And but in the Chennai, this thing was not kind of suiting up. I mean that physically, and then the in terms of your social circle, right? So that was kind of this thing, and that Chennai at that time is very different than now, compared to now, right? And so then I I look out for a job, and I got in touch with one company called Mobians. I think it was started by IIT Bombay guys, and I was the first employee. And again, they were they were three people, and then I was the fourth one which joined. Three co-founder, and I was the first one. And then it was a phone interview and two round of phone interview. And at that time, phone interview was rare, right? I mean, nowadays it happens, right? I mean, that remote interview. At that time, everyone basically wants to basically come face to. At that time, wants any interviewer to interview to come to the face to face interview. It was phone interview, two round of interview, three round of interview, and they just gave me an offer, and then joined that. I mean that region where I joined that is first of all, it's a small company, right? Again, you expedite your learning, and second is Mumbai, right? I mean that is exception, right? So that is one that I just took I didn't look at basically another distance. That's the first job I applied for, and I got an offer. I just joined that. And that time basically the hiring and this thing is not that prevalent, right? I mean that is very clumsy. There was no LinkedIn or whatever, or LinkedIn. Even if there was LinkedIn, I don't know, but there's not no hiring happening on that, right? I mean that so it's just a referral, and you just kind of so that's how I got my first job. I think
So this,
I told my friend, okay, this is my resume. My friend posted in the IIT alumni network because he's from the IIT, and then he posted in the IIT Bombay alumni network. Someone basically, these are the new startup. They looked at it, called me up, and that's how basically discovery happens, and then
right.
job.
True. So interestingly, what you've done so far, and to be honest, I would love to understand your mindset back then, is you've taken quite a bold decision, right? You mentioned you come from a lower middle class, grown up somewhere in not a very well informed place, right? Back then, right? It's more of the fact, and obviously you come out, do engineering, move to another place. You're moving out of your place. You're moving out of your comfort zone altogether, right? You're moving to south. Maybe as you mentioned, there could be certain challenges with respect to social circle. You still take the bolder move of going across and really working with these early stage. While I understand that learning always, as you mentioned, that there are good people working in these smart companies, even they are small, but there's another kind of a mindset that is somewhere somewhat stressing for you. It would be a financial stability. What was going through your mind back then? What was it? Was it that jo hoga kar lenge? I understand that that mindset would have been prevalent, keeping the age in place, but how did you actually tell yourself that this is what will really make it, and this is what I'm here for? I'm not here to get lost in the larger companies, so they have their own perks and benefits, but somehow you left that across, you gave that away. What was your mindset back then?
So I mean what I mean that at that time basically there are multiple things, but now basically with the retrospect, right? I mean that because if you see, right, all your life is basically discovering yourself, right? Who you are, right? I mean that and maybe some year down the line, some year back you may have taken some decision in rush, but some element was there. Basically the one element which I think was prevalent is building things. I think that is if I trace back, right? I mean that, and then I keep going back into the college schools and this thing. So I like building things. I mean that building things, it can be anything, right? Any project or any other this thing. In the at the school level, and even after that, building something from scratch, it always fascinates me, right? And at that time, multiple thing converges, right? I mean that first stage I have to cover up the ground, right? From the programming point of view and from the building point of view. I want to work on an interesting problem because I want to learn fast. I mean that I actually want to learn fast because at that time some of my friends were working in big companies, right? Infosys or whatever, TCS and Wipro thing. And I used to kind of not discuss, but in the passing by or when you are get together, they say, okay, what do you do, right? I mean that they used to say, okay, there's something happening in the US at the night time, this night duty, and then you do some data entry plus some data analysis, building this report, that report, sending it across. One category of work is that. Another category of work is, okay, they already have some system, you have to kind of do certain basic small thing, right? I mean that. So I didn't feel that. No, it's no. I didn't feel it's inspiring, right? I mean that that doesn't motivate me. But kind of if you say, okay, you are working on this and building from scratch and kind of taking care of all the aspect, whether it's from the building point of view or a programming point of view, building, designing your database, kind of writing different levels of abstraction, right? Software abstraction, building an application on that, on the top of it, right? All these things, right? If you kind of get a full exposure to these things, so you learn many things. I mean, you learn everything, but it required to build thing from the scratch. And these small companies gives me that opportunity. And that learning was, if I kind of narrow it down, learning and building, right? I mean that it happens hand in hand, because you can't just learn in vacuum, right? I mean that you have to build and then basically you learn, right? I mean, then you know the practical kind of thing, nut and bolts of building things. And so that was the primary driver. I mean, the learning. I mean, that I was just optimizing around learning. And then the finance, so kind of in first company, which in Chennai, they were financially stable because they have a good big clients. I mean that at that time, and they were financially stable. And but the other company, the Mumbai-based company, right? They were not financially stable. They just raised a small round of fund, and kind of they have runway of 1 year or so, right? I mean that they didn't tell me at that time, but after that I just back calculated. Probably that's what they have, and they probably overpromised some of the things, right? I mean, but then I joined, I mean, because the learning was expediting, right? I mean that, and that domain was very interesting, right? I mean that on the Mobians, they are building a location platform, right? At that time, there was no GPS in the mobile phones, right? I mean, so at that time, you have to kind of build a software which interact with these hardware of these telecom operators, right? I mean, and there was some machine level coding is also involved. So an idea was very fascinating. From the from the mobile cell phone tower, right? I mean that you figure out the location of that mobile, right? To triangulate that thing and figure out the location, and then that's the location platform. And on the top of it, you build different applications, kind of dating app, local dating app, or a kind of child tracker app for parents, or kind of this thing. It's very fascinating. If you see, even now, basically, if you think of this thing, right, on that location platform, you have to build these applications. These are very interesting application. Any developer will get excited by that. I mean, and if you get a chance to work on it from the ground up, I mean that there's nothing like it. And then another good thing, I mean, another factor, basically, I joined this company. In the earlier company, right, first company, I was the first C++ developer. Everyone was basically kind of doing modeling on the MATLAB and this thing. So I don't have any other programmer to learn from, the senior one or whatever, right? When I joined this Mumbai-based company, there are three founder, and two of them were technical person. They were doing the programming, right? I mean, but kind of in the IIT Bombay, you get a good exposure. They were good at basically programming, so it was a great opportunity to learn from it, right? I mean that it again expedite my learning process, right? So that was kind of another factor basically which I joined in. First stage, learning, building things from the scratch and learning in the process. Second is on the programming side of it. I have some peer with whom I can discuss, and I made a couple of good friends there. I mean that in that organization.
Right. So you also mentioned, while we go deeper in that relation, you also mentioned how exactly, as you mentioned, there were not a lot of financial viability or
Yeah.
stability for this Mumbai startup, right? You mentioned how exactly you walk in and you become somewhat, you you basically convert your own effort into some kind of a pay, right? So can you walk me through the whole journey that you narrated, wherein you have mentioned exactly that, okay, the paycheck is what you never asked for, and somehow you get that paycheck in front of your eyes, which is often, so that the whole story that you narrated to me the other day, if you can help us understand, because that gives you goosebumps in the sense that, yeah, someone who actually does not hail from a very strong financial background, and we all understand that money has its own pros and cons, right? And somewhere he takes a step back and thinks about learning first. And to be honest, more than learning, he's ready to see the kind of potential that he's walking for the product that he's building. When he sees that in front of the eyes. So a little. I'll leave up to you, and I'll leave up to you to explain that whole and narrate that whole story that you mentioned the other day.
Yeah, about this Mumbai-based company, right? I mean that which
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, so when I joined, I kind of this company, the compensation was good, decent. I mean, that given the benchmark at that time, right? And first few months it was working fine. I mean, and then the financial crunch happens, right? I mean that, and then there was sudden some start with the delay, right? It generally happens, right? So and then kind of so. A few good thing happens, right? I mean that I don't know basically why. I mean, so when came to Mumbai, right? I mean that first few months I was living with someone else, and then kind of one good thing which I did, right? I mean, uh, first few months I was living with the founders. That's so kind of some of the kind of rental thing was taken care of, right? I mean that's good part. And but once basically kind of I have to move out, right? I mean that from that shared apartment, right? Then one good thing I have limited amount, right? I mean whatever money I have, I just gave 1 year advance rent. So the financial thing was sorted, at least for that that front, right? I was living as a paying guest, right? I mean that. So I just gave the upfront this thing. It helps. I mean that then you can negotiate on the rent, and kind of you can negotiate on the food and other stuff, right? I mean that you are the basic thing was kind of sorted, right? All this thing is kind of managing the parents' expectation, right? I mean that because they were thinking, okay, you are earning that much, and then suddenly basically paychecks dried up. But kind of somehow basically kind of still kind of fascinated by that idea and kind of on the learning side of it. But and I think I remember now, I mean the 6 7 months basically went without pay, but kind of because when I was getting paid, right, I just kind of used that money to kind of just upfront 1 year kind of a secure. So that is kind of good thing. And second is kind of on the financial front. I mean that how I survive. I'm talking about that. I mean the how I survived is just limit your expenses, right? That's the simple thing. And because our office was inside IIT, I just living bang opposite to IIT. So just a walking distance. You go to the office, come back, and kind of. And most of the time I used to spend in the office, and even night out and this thing. I just come home to just sleep, nothing else. That's 4 5 hours, and kind of even early morning, and then 5 o'clock 6 o'clock in the morning, and then probably I go back again 12 o'clock for lunch to the IIT Bombay. One good thing is once you're in the IIT Bombay office, then their canteen and this thing is easily accessible, where you get a subsidized food, and then basically that's how you kind of survive.
Right.
Uh, so but still basically kind of I so that part was sorted because I just secured that part. And reason thing is I don't want to think about these things, okay, renting and other stuff, because I don't want to basically my brain to be distracted by, and I still do that. I mean that so just secure these part and then just focus on the more important thing, right? I mean that at least for me. And but kind of for
Mhm.
7 months it was too much this thing, because after 3 4 months you start feeling the pinch and this thing, but you are still giving it a chance and kind of this thing. And again at that time kind of the job searching and this thing, right? I mean that that's again the stressful thing, right, in any way. Because someone is always judging you, right? That and for me it's like kind of I built this thing and kind of whatever, right? I mean that so I may not be very on good at certain things or expert on certain things, programming side of it, but kind of I'm hustler, right, at that time. That this thing, and and I have a right attitude about learning and this thing. So so that get extended. I mean that I would say, I mean that if I go back, I mean that I should not extend it for 7 months. Probably after 3.1 I should have basically look out. I mean that's what I think. But one few good thing happened. I mean I made one good friend there. I mean they're still a very good friend. And there basically we are doing C++ and Java in that company. And then that friend joined, and he was, and then basically together, and during that period I got to learn about polygram and this thing. I used to read a lot. I mean that and anything about programming, new programming language. So it gives me a perfect lab. I mean that thing, right? I mean that learning new things. And then one of my friend basically kind of got together, right? I mean that we started learning new things. We started learning Python and the Ruby on Rails and other stuff, right? I mean that. So you get a perfect peer, right? I mean that. I just don't want to disturb that. I mean that. Just so I continued, even if I not getting paid, I just come to office, me and that my friend, and then kind of we just keep learning, building small project or whatever, right? I mean that building small utility and this thing and learning these things up. So that kind of kept me going for some time. But the one final day, they say, okay, probably you should look out for another job because there's a financial crunch, right? We can't pay you. Although they were not paying it, but earlier they were promising they will pay you. But at that time, like, okay, we can't even promise to pay you. Your things are very bleak. So then I said, okay, probably I should move out. And good thing happened. I mean that because in that vicinity, right? I mean that because you are working on telecom infrastructure, in that in our vicinity, there is a company which is working in a similar domain, which is a company called Roamware. They are providing the roaming solution. That time roaming was like hot potato, right? I mean that, and they build a company out of it. They're a pretty much a stable company, and they again basically kind of interacting with the hardware of these telecom operators, right? I mean that, and because I worked on a similar thing in my kind of startup, then it became handy, right? It just become a, so it was not even an interview, just a kind of you just walk into things. So yeah, I mean, I hope basically I provide the context here, right?
Cool. So, Vipul, interestingly, from an employee, you went on to become a founder yourself, right? And that would have been a big call on your basically on your part. But interestingly, you also went on to really work with some of the best names in the industry back then, Red F, Bollywood, Hungama. What do you think would be your top three lessons that you would say in this whole experience of being a founder and then ultimately working with some of the market leaders back then? What would that be from your end? Yeah.
So there's such little bit kind of context here. I mean that when I was in Romeware, then basically again C++, then basically I moved on the web development side of it, web technologies, and uh, and then basically I did the freelancing thing. I got associated with some startup again from the IIT Bombay kind of guys, and then kind of I working for them. I mean that building their tech from ground up, and because by that time I become good at it, right? I mean that from the programming side of it, and then that startup again didn't work out. I mean then basically that same group basically got together and started doing the consulting work or commission work, and one of the co-founder, right? I mean that because if you're from IIT alumni, you have a access to network, right? I mean that so he somehow got in touch with kind of these guys, right? I mean that founder of Rediff and Bollywood Hungama, right? And we started pitching because we are good at technology. These people are probably, they were also good at technology, but there's certain gaps there, right? I mean that. So we started pitching there. I mean that whatever is there, right? I mean that. So we got basic chance to collaborate on some of the project, very interesting project, and so that's how basically we got into this thing, right? I mean that on the learning part, right? I mean that for us it was good. I mean that because it was giving us money. I mean that to in order to survive, right? I mean that in order to get uh, build our team and building our own idea, working on our own ideas. On the learning, from the learning point of view, right? I mean that what I kind of realized, right? I mean that now basically I still think sometimes things, right? These companies kind of or any big companies, right? I mean that their leadership is always good. They want to solve the problem because that mindset is there, and but kind of and we got the chance to collaborate because we got directly in touch with the decision maker, right? I mean that so that actually helps. And second thing is where generally problem comes, right? I mean that where you kind of if you would have basically gone via some normal route, right? Okay, mid level management or whatever, right? I would not We would not have get that opportunity to work on or collaborate on such projects. So that's my this thing. Okay, kind of you kind of bypass or cut through this bureaucracy and then kind of got in touch with the decision maker early on, right? I mean that It always helps. Because generally, right, and any leader, right, I mean that they think ahead, right, I mean that okay, these are the things we want to build. And probably mid-level managing basically some of the things, right, I mean that so sometime they move forward, sometime kind of insecurity or kind of, or some aspect of ego comes in. So that's why basically it's very difficult to cut through that bureaucracy. uh, Even if we call it private this thing, but that exists, I mean that I feel.
Interesting. Wanted to go deeper into your journey with respect to what you go ahead and do. And majorly, there's a shift, as you mentioned. You move from from C programming to a web development. From a web development, to be honest, one as you mentioned, you had your own team that you were freelancing and basically exposed yourself towards more of a not freedom, that would be the right word, but yeah, more of autonomy towards what to do in a day, right? Entrepreneurship somehow teaches you that. And then you went on to ideally become and really go out and raise funds. Also with that, today there's a lot of talk about basically raising funds, doing something on your own. That's something often people are talked about, right? And there's a huge lot of a debate with 70 hours, whether you want to work for yourself or you want to work for someone else. What's your piece of advice, or how do you think, if given chance, how would you make that different? Or do you think that the journey that you currently had, wherein you had the right pivots at the right time, would be something which is more ideal? Sometimes work on yourself, sometimes freelance, sometimes be a part of a growing team, and as right now maybe make those moves. What would your advice be in terms of someone who's looking for autonomy, right? And somewhere in the middle, I would say mid senior level kind of a position at this point.
So I mean, so one good thing which happens if you building your own thing, right, I mean that you get a very 360 view, right? Building things is not easy, right? So it actually depends upon the personality of, or in the personality of a person, right? I mean that if someone is suppose if someone is good at certain things, is expert in certain things, right, I mean that he should definitely explore opportunities in existing companies, right? Suppose if, for example, someone is good at security, or someone is good at architecting things, right? I mean that you should definitely explore, because now there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of companies who are building a great products and challenging product, interesting projects, right? And they require, they kind of lack that kind of skill set. So definitely you should do that. I mean, uh, the whole idea is, right, I mean that you have to basically you have to be you have to become good at certain things, right? I mean that and and you should compound on that so that you become extremely good at those things, right? So that generally pays off, right? I mean that eventually, if not right away, but eventually it pays off. But you have to compound on whatever you decide to kind of do on, right? I mean that it can be programming, it can be whatever, database architecture, it can be open source contribution, it can be anything, right? I mean that from the technical point of view, or it can be sales, it can be wisdom, right? I mean that whatever you are good at, what's your calling, right? I mean, if you have figured that out, then you have to compound on that. and 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 if you keep doing it every day, every week, right? I mean that you become expert in that. Once you become expert in that, then it's a sea full of opportunities. That's one thing, I mean that I would say. So it's completely depend on basically kind of finding your own niche, right? I mean, finding your own thing.
Ikigai,
Huh?
finding your own ikigai mainly.
Yeah. Yeah, ikigai, yeah. So that is kind of one this thing. And financial thing kind of will take care of itself. I mean that if you must too much optimize or prematurely optimize, right? I mean that for certain things, basically in low run, in the shorter period or mid-term, you might get this thing, but in the long run, basically you will lose out. I mean, that's clear cut thing. The people who are working on data science, machine learning now, right? I mean, they are working on it at 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, right? Now it's getting paid off.
Right. True.
And in anything, I mean that any aspect. So that is kind of one thing. Or someone basically maybe enterprising, right? I mean, the who love building things and all aspect of building things, they should definitely basically start their own thing. I mean, there is no doubt about that. So that's kind of, it's not advice. It's just basically these are the things. It's general things, right? It's generic thing. But generally वही होता है कि kind of you in kind of daily chorus or daily kind of rush of the things, we generally miss out the basics. That's what I feel.
So interestingly, as you mentioned, you basically have folks that you've seen have spent 20 years, XY, maybe 20, 15, 20 years in really data science and analytics overall, right? So going back to the current role and majorly the role that you currently play, trying to understand a little bit more about the current role that you are at this point playing in the Tartan. What exactly does your periphery majorly comprises of? What is the kind of speciality that your team currently is bringing on the table for the organization?
So currently, Tartan, just a bit of context, Tartan is building a very interesting product, right? I mean, that we are kind of, our core product is kind of income and employment verification system. And this is our kind of, and this is a API product. This is the one set of API we are providing. And we kind of complement it with other set of APIs also, right? Which is KYC API, ITR, and others, this thing. When I say API product, what it means is you can any organization can kind of integrate it with their systems, right? I mean that. So my team basically brings up certain expertise in building these API products, right? I mean that because it involved kind of whole API development thing, right? So essentially, what is happening is there's unstructured data out there, or there is kind of not efficient way to do things, right? You are just kind of exposing a API to kind of so that people can consume, right? When you say people here, people are probably banks, NBFCs, and fintech, right? So whatever the in terms of we have around 30 people team, right? I mean, building these products out, right? I mean, the API products, and we have a kind of good set of people, kind of good at uh, infrastructure side of it, right? Because building these things up, basically, you need to have a good understanding of the system and infrastructure side of it, API building, Selenium automation, right? I mean that. So these are the skill set my team brings in, and we have kind of data science initiatives also, because some of the problem which we are solving are kind of, suppose say one of the problem we solve is extracting kind of data from the payslip document, and and basically we are building models to extract that data. So these are the current skill set my team has, right? I mean that if a system side of it, API building, the backend side of it, and the data science side of it.
Got it. So I wanted to go deeper in terms of when you're building a team. And right now, as you mentioned, leadership people have the hindsight to look beyond the regular thing that they're more of builders. And today you play that role in terms of leadership. And you, to be honest, are must be hiring or basically looking at things beyond that your executive. So what's your must have the moment you are sitting on an interview table? What is the kind of qualities that you majorly focus on, or I would say, what's your way to hire better for your team?
Okay, yeah. So there are few things, right? I mean that. Yeah, so our team has kind of mix of people. I mean that if you say if I horizontally kind of divide them, right? Some are kind of are good at specific things, right? And some people are journalists, right? I mean that they have a kind of good understanding on all side of things, right? I mean, so when I kind of look at the kind of when I kind of hiring, right? I mean that one thing basically I look at is kind of it's a new domain, right? Because there are a lot of other technical details, right? I mean, which are there. So someone should have. I mean, it depends on the experience level. Someone should have a kind of programming kind of this thing and knowledge. I mean that's there. I mean the problem solving aspect especially. So he may be good at whatever, right? X programming language or Y programming language. That is irrelevant, but kind of the problem solving becomes a more important thing. And second is the attitude, right? I mean that because some of the things which we are building uh, in India has not been built, right? I mean that especially the income and employment verification piece, and in the US and other market there are existing player, right? So we don't have any playbook to copy, first of all, right? I mean that because if you build a e-commerce D2C or whatever, right, the other other industry, you have some playbook, right? I mean that to copy or certain role model, right, which you can just copy. So we are building from the scratch these kind of API products, and so problem solving is essential. Second is right attitude, and again the rate of learning. Once he joins the organization, we just try to assess basically kind of on these fronts basically how he each kind of how he fares, right? I mean that so the right attitude, problem solving, and learning rate. Some examples, some in the interview you don't know learning rate, right? Because when you come to the job, then you come to know. But if you have something, right, which kind of characterize that thing, okay, you overcome that obstacle, right? And it should come as a genuine this thing, not a makeup thing, right? I mean, so then you kind of these are the things I try to assess when it comes to the final interview to me. I mean,
So while there could be the good parts that you go ahead and assess, I think there would be a lot of learnings also now that you've run the show for a good amount of time, right? What do you think were your biggest learnings about hiring while going any particular learning that you understood? Okay, I'm not gonna hire, or maybe you learned the hard way that okay, these kind of skills or these kind of person, as you mentioned, someone can come and make up about learning, but you are fairly smart enough to understand that okay, well, this is a real scenario, or this is a chat GPT based scenario,
yeah.
right? So, so what's been your learning if I would ask about what could be not don't do it, or what's your don't in terms of hiring?
What I
Basically, the setbacks, if I yeah.
Yeah, if kind of sometime one of the thing is the attitude, right? I mean that sometime you hire people with not right set of attitude. I mean, when I say attitude, so that thing is very clear, right? I mean that okay, the mental model, right? I mean that I just talk about that mental model. Mental model is simple, right? I mean that it's like a team. When I say team, it means we have to build a team which is going to be successful, right? I mean that, and for that every member, every this thing should have a clear cut role. I mean that's again kind of this thing, the way happen in any sport team, right? There's a fixed slot. I mean that you have to perform, right? I mean that sometimes you can run certain experiment. You hire someone, okay, probably okay, he may not be good at whatever that x dimension, but he's good at other dimension, and you hire, right? I mean that and then basically you see that the dimension you ignore, right? I mean that or bypass for that candidate, probably there's a negative impact. The attitude is one thing basically which I say attitude, team player, right? I mean that which you can't assess in the interview, or it's very difficult to assess, right? Team player, I mean how good he gel with the team, or how good he is in the collaboration, right? Because now a lot of software development happens the collaboration, whether it's a product design, tech, business, right? Especially in the small setup, it's more of a collaboration. Collaboration with the different stakeholders. So that so kind of sometimes you miss that, right? I mean that and that comes up. I mean that few months down the line or few quarter down the line, you see, okay, probably even it get you get these signals probably in first 2 months, not in the first month, but the second month, third month onward, you get basically these things, right? I mean that so these were the kind of learning, right? I mean that the team player, right attitude, there's certain overlap there, but kind of just start focusing more on that. And uh, and then basically once you interview, right? I mean that suppose say you are looking for a profile where you need expert. I mean that then basically skill set becomes the primary factor, right?
Yeah.
I mean so someone on the system design side, he should be very good at basically building things up. And for some of the things, you can some of the candidate you say, okay, probably for this role we can start with not the expert. Okay, on that parameter dimension you can just lower your kind of benchmark, but he's good at other things. Probably if he quickly his learning rate becomes quick. I mean that's the kind of some you can say key some leap of faith you take. Okay, learning rate is good, probably he might become far more productive than we kind of get, get in the first assessment. So on the hiring front, basically these parameter, and I just keep tweaking these parameter depending upon the roles at my level. I mean, although we have different
Interesting.
amount of interview skill set wise, otherwise we have different amount of interviews. Um In fact, we have kind of last year, basically, we did a lot of hiring from the campuses, and
Right.
uh, and then their basic campuses, you skill set wise very difficult to judge, right? I mean, they were just fresh out of college. Any college projects for them looks a big deal, but it's not. I mean that, uh, but uh, but then basically you keep on this thing. You kind of harp on this thing, problem solving and right attitude, right? I mean that these two things becomes very handy. Skills you can learn,
Interesting.
right? I mean that skill gap you can learn. I mean that we can expedite that. So yeah, these are the things. I mean that
Right.
there's no
So
binary answer to these questions, but
obviously, there can't be any binary. It also depends on experience, exposure, and this industry as well as where you're active in and you where and to be honest, the stage of people that also you're looking for. Interesting. So right now, to be honest, with interest of time, we've almost surpassed, and we're about to reach six. So thanks a lot, Vipul, for joining us today. I would take the liberty to really thank you and then basically summarize the whole discussion that we had today. I think it was pretty learning, and there are a lot of things that I'm going to take back. One definitely is the love for what polygram essays talk about. That's something that I think I would be loud enough to tell everyone that if this is something which can change people's mind, at least I'm going to go back and read and advise everyone to go ahead and read. That's a big takeaway that I think Vipul taught us today. Apart from that, I think the larger thing that continues to be something which makes people better than everyone else is the ability to really focus on building things, and the way that you predominantly have chosen and made your career about building first and not finance first is a testimony of the fact that at whatever background or wherever you are born does not make a difference the kind of impact that you can bring on the table for the people and the organizations that you get associated or work for. I think that was a very very big takeaway from the whole discussion that we had today, apart from the fact that yes, when you are into a leadership position, you always think faster, better sometimes, and maybe larger than life kind of an approach that somehow stays with you and helps you really build your team. I think you're doing the same thing with Tartan at this point of time, with really going out, finding the right kind of set of people, the use cases that can really change. As you mentioned, you are one of the first in the country doing the kind of work that you guys are doing. It's a testimony of the fact that you're still out building first and not keeping the mind that you're not into finance. That I think, as you mentioned, is a part of the process, but it's not the only process that someone has to think upon. So I think these were my three takeaways, to be honest, Vipul, from the whole discussion that we had for the last 1 hour. Any departing points from your end?
uh, I think we covered a lot of this thing, right? I mean, it was very kind of nice experience, right? And interacting with you guys. This is my first kind of appearance, such appearance, so it make it even more special for me. And parting advice, I mean, for this thing, one thing, it doesn't matter where you start from. What matters is your learning rate.
Right. So learning rate is what everyone needs to put their KPIs, and not the hours that they put in their work. Could be 70 or 80. That doesn't. I leave that debate all the way to the people.
20
Yes.
on that front, or 70 or 30 or whatever, right? I mean, that you
Yeah.
should, it depends, right? I mean, that, or you should invest in yourself. I mean, the for sure. I
So
mean, that,
yeah, yeah. So every night before you sleep, ask, what did I learn today? It's be a Ranchod Das in whatever form you can. The guy will always take you far. That's what I can put that across, people.
yeah, cool.
Interesting. Thanks a lot, people. Thanks for joining us. Have a rest of the evening, and thanks a lot, guys, for joining us for the next one of the episodes for Beyond Code. Hope to see you again next week. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah.